This video includes discussion of sensitive topics such as suicide, self-harm, and mental illness. It will also thoroughly and immediately spoil the entire plot of the video game In Stars and Time. If you haven't played yourself, please at least consider throwing a few bucks its way. It's a great game that deserves your support, and wait. No. Not again. Oh god, please! I can't do this again! Don't send me back, please! Start Again, a Prologue is a 2021 RPG Maker demo by indie developer Insert Disc 5, precision engineered to make you, yes you, existentially soul-flatteningly hopeless. If you are finally beginning to forget the creeping apathy and ceaseless repetition of the cursed era of play from which this game sprung, well, Start Again is here to fix that. You play as Siffrin, the rogue of a bog-standard fantasy RPG party with a standard quest to save the kingdom and their standard half-complete dungeon crawl. Slink through the castle, gather knickknacks, fight retro turn-based battles, all the while your main character's internal monologue traverses all 5 stages of grief simultaneously as they're dragged through this exact same quest for the umpteenth time. You lose to the final boss, Siffrin dies, and you simply reload back in at square one. You're just kind of replaying a hyper-condensed fantasy adventure over and over again in hopes of achieving 2 possible unique endings, with each neutral loop resetting back to square one. The game is a little frustrating, and that's on purpose. Achieving a new ending requires Siffrin to either A, flawlessly perform spontaneity in front of his party to successfully convince them he hasn't aged several lifetimes in a few hours, all the while making sure not to openly use any loop-acquired knowledge, or B, purposefully act sus. That would constitute remembering the location of every key and required item and getting them all without having to figure them out again. Only after your crew has been thoroughly perplexed will they band together to comfort you. I've heard of some people getting this true ending on their second loop, but achieving it is rather confusing in my opinion. Even I, who played it spoiled, got an accidental neutral my second time. You aren't explicitly directed on how to act perfect or act sus, and during your first loop, Siffrin takes note of both ways to act better next time and ways to go faster. This makes it unintuitive for a player to naturally choose one extreme, not to mention the relative tediousness of the combat and the expected but nonetheless annoying repetition. As Start Again Siffrin, you are utterly powerless. You are just as clueless as he is on how to avoid a simple repeat of the last death march. You're stuck doing the same, increasingly tedious set of actions ad nauseum, retaining none of your required strength or progress, and you watch as Siffrin swings between frustration, despair, and complete apathy as his world shrinks and shrinks. Are his companions even people anymore in this frozen state? Or have they been reduced to sets of endlessly repeating lines? Is he doomed to play act with the pale copies of his own family for all eternity? If you finally do sufficiently freak them out, Sif's fugue is pierced, and for a single heartbreaking moment, his party is returned to him. You are finally allowed to win against the king. Yet still, the loops do not break. Start Again is existentialism at its most concentrated. Nothing matters in this game, the power of friendship is bullshit, fuck you. It is the perfect demo for its eventual, fully complete edition In Stars and Time, a game that does absolutely none of what I just described and to which none of my previous analysis applies at all. In Stars and Time, or ESAT in comparison, tries to be as merciful as it can get without ceasing to contain a time loop. ESAT's Siffrin is graced with a fast-forward button that can zoom in and out mid-scene, various save points to loop back to upon death. Useful objects now sparkle so you don't have to remember their location. You even have your own fruity, white diamond cosplaying tutorial creature providing on-demand hints and calling you condescending pet names. Hell, I've beaten this game before with only completing the entire standard loop front to back 2 times. This is a Siffrin with a startling degree of control over his own circumstances. ESAT Friend's horror has never been that of helplessness or that of repetition. The fact that will eventually be revealed and define the core thesis of the game is the undercurrent of his every action from the very beginning. Siffrin, although subconsciously, has been doing this to himself. In Stars and Time is an excellent game, but if you're here, you already knew that. It's also far too dense a game to comprehensively dissect in a single video. Rather than attempt to review or write a Bible on it, I intend to conduct a why it works on an element I believe it does particularly well, and one absolutely no one is surprised I specifically am tackling, the metanarrative. In Stars and Time has been rightfully praised up and down for its ludonarrative harmony, e.g. the degree to which the gameplay mechanics work hand in hand with the narrative. This game takes great pains to make everything diegetic diegetic it possibly can, and this incorporation of the tried-and-true RPG mechanics it embraces into its lore means that the game can use the way a player is inclined to treat a game of this genre as a storytelling device. Of course, meta-commentary is only one of the many themes ESAT has in its arsenal, yet not only does it prove a juicy aspect of the narrative that I want to take a focused look on, but the way it comments on itself as a game is used to further drive in its other themes, such as mental health and disability. Siffrin, over the course of the narrative, grows to embody the same kind of fading emotional investment and immersion of a player endlessly replaying the same game. Within the script, Siffrin comes to the realization that most players will subconsciously come to outside of universe, that even the most all-encompassing of fantasies are inherently finite, and the very thing that makes them appealing, their immersive power, is the first to fade with repetition. Anyone who's played Undertale is familiar with this idea. Siffrin is put through a sort of flowification in real time. But while Undertale is more focused on responding to the end result of this complete immersion break and trying to spot it in player behavior, Siffrin's arc is more focused on exploring the how and why this occurs. Why do people return to a fictional world past the point where immersion is broken? What causes a person to strip every last piece of content out of something they love until it is left an empty husk? Why do that to yourself? Okay, talking about meta-narrative can get pretty complicated and pretty navel-gazy pretty fast. You can make entire diagrams trying to philosophically define each level of fiction if, you were some kind of nerd. Nah, ESAT gives us enough boundary-crossing bullshit to pick apart how a game can bridge the barriers of reality and fiction just by picking through its own examples, and this can be used to illustrate exactly why this kind of thing works so well, though I can't guarantee I won't make some graphs anyway, but that's not because they're necessary, that's just because I'm a hack. I started out this video by comparing ESAT to its prologue in terms of their quality of life, not only to point out the difference in the way their central premise is treated, but to serve as an easy introduction to one of the game's most straightforward metatextual elements, the connection between the demo/prologue and the main game's timeline. Upon finishing ESAT, that Twinkie object head Tumblr sexy they loop I mentioned can reveal, if you gave them enough attention throughout the game, that they are actually the Siffrin from the timeline of the prologue. That Sif, if you can recall, was unable to escape their loops. In frustration, they made a wish at their favorite tree to, quote, get out, and for, quote, anyone to help them. The monkey's paw twisted, and they were whisked off to the universe of ESAT, transformed into a star to serve as the guide to a version of themselves newly trapped in the time loop, thus satisfying the get out and someone helping them conditions. Now, on its own, this plot point would place Start Again as a straightforward prologue to ESAT, with just a really complicated bridge between them. However, a closer look at exactly what the differences are between the demo and the main game reveals something a little more interesting, that the early installment weirdness of SAP's world is fully intended to be canon. Remember all those quality of life features the main game has that the prologue lacks? The ability to choose where to loop back, the fast-forward function, sparkly keys, hints. They are all explicitly diegetic tutorials, all given to Siffrin by loop. Everything not contained in the sad little configurations text box that both games open with is diegetically a loop original. The differences between the prologue and main game are now actively fueling the misery of Loop's little Gasterian nightmare. That's a good, straightforward example of one way ESAT likes to go meta, the thing where an in-universe thing, or as I'm going to call it an inside thing, is deliberately fashioned to closely resemble some out-of-universe aspect of our experience with the story as a piece of art. In this case, Loop's backstory is written to resemble their, I guess, production history. This works because now, noticing out-of-universe details such as differences between the demo and the main game do not turn on your outside brain, but rather redirect you to another inside thing and keeps your immersion. It will register completely to a player that SAP lacks quality of life features, not because it is a demo, or because it's trying to tell a self-contained story with less content, but because its world does not have a loop, and that it is only possible for ESAT to have the success it took his predecessor thousands of loops to achieve, because he has his own former Sif helping him. The second effect of this is that the fact that ESAT is a game turns from something you have to overlook to be immersed into an additional storytelling device. If you recognize Loop for what they are in our reality, a scrapped version of a hero, an uncannily similar variant of the person who is able to succeed, doomed by existing in a fundamentally unfinished world that is unsalvageable without being changed to the point of destruction, the existential nightmare of existing before the world you exist in has evolved enough to work properly, or or them as a repurposed character who was forcibly redesigned and recast in a different role, that all feels almost intentional, and that's on top of them being a canonical tutorial character, forced to exist for the sole purpose of using their cursed reality-bending knowledge to help one specific person. Hence, I can be even more miserable about loops specifically by acknowledging their meta. That second function, where out-of-universe material that exists regardless is used to sneak in lore, is used in a lot of little instances, specifically in the way the menus and the UI are presented. For example, all of the character's spells and abilities are given names that reflect that character's personalities. Siffrin's are all awful puns because he is Siffrin. Mira's have bubbly, melodramatic titles because she's the chosen one and an enthusiastic nerd. Isabeau's are all exclamations because he's a happy, shouty dude, and Odil's are all matter-of-fact with Roman numerals because she's an academic. It even goes down to Odil's spells all being named number 3, subtly and immediately conveying her experience by her already being on the third iteration of each ability. The party members start off at level 45 because they've been adventuring together for a while. Siffrin's sprites in battle and on menus change with his mental state, shifting to a darker and darker expression as he deteriorates, and eventually the punny names of his attacks disappear. Even the post-death screen, which will sometimes note how Sif just died in a classic Minecraft style, will shift into what are clearly Sif's internal thoughts, or glitch out to contain exclamations when he's upset. When I, the player, notice, for example, the differences in the way the character's spells are named, I'm not exactly going to directly assume that this means the power names or entire battle UI are somehow canon, but I am going to assume that they represent a real thing that actually exists in this universe, in this case the character's personalities. Therefore, I'm not taken out of the game by noticing the outside detail of the UI, and the UI can now be used as a tool for the narrative. I've listed these specific examples because, in my opinion, I think immersion is the extent of their purpose in this game. It's just pure and simple diegesis maxing. The body of this video is going to be analyzing the two instances of this meta I do believe were included for an even deeper purpose, the looping system and the battle mechanics. The true power of creating plotlines that strongly parallel your out-of-universe experience with the game as a piece of art, and the power of giving program-level details like menus and the battle system in-universe implications, is that the game can now use how you are treating the system as a storytelling tool, and every single aspect of this experience has been plotted around turning you into Siffrin. In Stars and Time immediately starts playing with its own genre tropes by seemingly taking them at face value, with some minor tweaks in the framing. As established, our main character is the rogue of a seasoned adventuring party about to complete their final challenge, scaling the corrupted House of Change, defeating the evil not king named King, and saving his curse from freezing the land of Vogard in time forever. Siffrin in the early game has the tendency to fade into the background. All the while we're learning the goals, backstories, and quirks of his teammates, he gives us little about himself. He may as well have popped out of thin air for the sole purpose of helping these other people save the world. This all changes when the house proceeds to almost immediately murder you the first time you enter it, hence the handy time loop, and come loop 3, the ability to loop back or forward to a specific floor of the house you've already reached. Getting through the house requires a lot of this. You'll hear that I keep emphasizing this ability of his, the fact that progressing the plot often means looping to one specific floor, scouring it for one tiny thing, and then immediately touching a tier so you can go back in time and show it to loop, and the fact that you need so few complete loops to actually resolve the plot. This is to make it clear that the system of time travel we're working with isn't really a circuit. It most clearly resembles a very stripped-down diegetic save point system. This has two main functions. First, it causes the looping aspect to occasionally fade into the abstract layer of the system of ESAT, the level of control you have over where and when to loop back, and the amount doing so is necessary turns deciding when to kill yourself to reset time into a core element of the gameplay, and its resemblance to simple save scumming means it's easy for a player to forget that they are diegetically dying every time they do this. The story now has the power to jump scare you by reminding you of this every time you start getting too comfortable with it. Small examples come in the way that every time you wake up from death, Sif will think about how that death felt in detail. The descriptions for each death rotate and get progressively darker as the game goes on, so just when you've gotten desensitized to making Siffrin slip on a banana peel to kill himself and Dormont, Siffrin's thoughts are here to remind you that, don't worry, him cracking his head open hasn't gotten any less painful while you weren't thinking about it. It's in fact gotten worse. And if that's still not enough misery for you, you have the option to force loop into showing you how to use your dagger to literally slit your own throat and kill yourself so you can end a loop whenever you want. Siffrin can now literally stab himself to death in order to save the few seconds it takes to find a tear to freeze him in time. This is horrifying. Trying it will put him in immense pain, and Loop freaks the fuck out. It's a really scary moment. It transcends the shock value of suicide. The game has created a situation where you have the completely voluntary option to slit your throat to save you a few seconds, and has frustrated and desensitized you into actually doing it. You know how serious this is the whole time, and still get shocked by just how visceral it is. The second effect of this looping system is that Siffrin is experiencing linear time in a strikingly similar way to the player, and the game can now use that to fuck with your head as much as it wants. The quote final boss fight against the king is an especially dense scene to highlight the way ESET uses looping forward and back to make achievements feel meaningless in a way more complex than just boring you by making you repeat them a bunch. This is a hard battle. Your first try is an instant kill that sends you back through the timeline to figure out how to survive even one turn. It's the cumulative challenge you would expect from the final boss of an RPG. If Siffrin dies to the king, the experience is not sugar-coated. Siffrin will wake up in the field nearly screaming with residual pain, and additional deaths linger on his inability to move, his family's cries of pain and frustration, with Siffrin begging to be killed first out of mercy. Death via king, despite its impermanence, is still built up as a genuine threat to Siffrin due to its sheer gruesomeness. So when you beat him and you're finally savoring your party members' joyous reactions and watching Mirabelle's cathartic conversation with the head housemaiden and to Siffrin, this is the moment victory against the king becomes meaningless, the moment he feels a tug on his stomach and is pulled back into that sunny field. But for you, the player, the battle gains true meaninglessness as Siffrin decides, against Loop's wishes, to continuously refight the king in order to ask him questions about time and witchcraft. This battle becomes one of the most repeated scenes of the game. You have to fight the king 6 times to finish Act 3. The way these conversations play out are striking. Siffrin will walk into the final chamber and start interrogating the king at the first opportunity. Meanwhile, all of his party members are just baffled that the usually quiet, focused Sif would take the time to do so in a life-or-death situation. Siffrin's party is always fighting the king for the very first time, so staying alive is their sole priority. Siffrin and us are now operating on a level of reality above them. It's not that this fight doesn't have stakes anymore for Sif. Learning about his erased homeland in these exchanges is extremely emotional. It's that he and his opponent are now privy to a goal that exists above the level of reality any other character is operating on. You feel the separation as Siffrin and the king just completely ignore the rest of the party as they try to wrench the name of Fantasy Cuba out of their lips. They're literally using the battle that determines the fate of Vogard as set dressing for their own confrontation. And that set dressing doesn't, go away while it stops being Sif's priority. The fight itself doesn't change or get harder on repeated loops. It just stops mattering if you actually win. There are a few loops where you can exhaust all the king's dialogue before you're finished fighting with him, and when that happened, I, and I've seen many others do so too, purposefully threw the king fight just so I wouldn't have to finish it. I just let Mira's shield wear off and Sif died, and then watched as they all screamed out in horror and pain. I was pulled out of that higher register and hit in the face with the fact that to the party, this is permanent death and the destruction of their entire homeland. But without realizing it, I found myself on a level where I didn't have to consider those as stakes. Eventually, Siffrin is able to gather enough information to truly confront the king and explain their shared heritage. He attempts to reason with the king on this basis, a risk he never would have taken if death to the king was a meaningful consequence anymore. The king tricks him, and we are subjected to the only consequence more severe than Siffrin's practiced end, that of another party member, Bonnie. It is horrifying. It's horrifying because we love Bonnie, because we've never encountered a scenario up close where Sif is the one left alive, and because we've been trained to see the death of a party member as a bigger deal than that of Siffrin. It's horrifying because, as much as Sif's goal has always been breaking the loops, this event is one part of a long pattern where he's punished for breaking the script with more and more horrifying events, forcing him back onto the beaten path he's been doing all this to finally leave. And on a meta level, it yanks you out of that Register B we entered after beating the king, where the goal is find out enough information to stop the time loop, and back into the Register A of our party, where don't let your family die is the goal we didn't realize we had grown out of. You can see this philosophy everywhere in ESET once you know where to look. The way the game turns all your favorite achievements into background noise as the stakes are raised, but still makes you achieve them. Like, take the friend quests as another example, a series of mandatory side quests that have Siffrin work a friend through a problem in order to give them an emotional revelation-fueled power-up. To do this, you first have to gather enough information to learn what each character's woes are, figure out Bonnie's 3 favorite foods by killing yourself via pineapple, go to Mira's room and distract her so you can look through her drawers, and travel around town to track down Odil's family tale. It's possible to do every single side quest for the first time in one loop, and Issa's requires all quests to have been done before his, so an all-quest loop is expected. But you don't have to do them all at once first. I didn't do it in my own playthrough. Doing an all-friend quest loop is actually quite a bit of talking for one go-around, but doing it on a second or third round without the time tracking down the required info to progress the loop is absolutely brutal pacing-wise. Even more so if you're still invested enough to want to sit through all that dialogue again. It's just 4 back-to-back emotional conversations, all about real-world topics. Mira struggles with her religion and asexuality, then Bonnie's survivor guilt, then Odil's relationship with her nationality, then Issa's with his self-esteem. It's a lot to process in a day, so naturally you're gonna want to skip through the friend quests when you do them and just try to get that 6 shield and craft break. Only skipping through the quest makes the skill slightly less effective. The game is practically taunting you. I know you liked those emotional conversations, I know they were a nice reward for your own attentiveness to your party members, but they're so tedious. You can skip through them and still get their skills, you know that, right? And now, these moments of emotional clarity that were so precious to you the first time turn into checkboxes. Your party member's emotional wellness is something to be maxed out for purely utilitarian purposes. And this meaninglessness is expanded upon by the battle system. Here, time loop means only Siffrin retains experience. The gulf between him and his party's strength starts off negligible, but gradually increases. Completing friend quests breaches the gulf between you and your party's strength in Act 3. Now you and your party can easily one-shot enemies in the house with the right craft match. For one beautiful loop, you're all in sync, and progression is easy. And then the tedium sets in. Siffrin slowly turns into a stronger and more versatile character, so much so that every other character's niche slowly gets infringed upon. He gets his own heal, attack buff, a rock-type spell, and eventually a paper type, rendering him completely capable of taking down enemies solo. By the time you reach Act 4, a new spell appears in Sif's menu, just attack. This does massive damage against regular enemies regardless of craft type, but it can't be used to set up a jackpot with the other characters, because who cares, right? At this point you're strong enough to simply not need your teammates' help. Upon reaching the final loop, Siffrin has just broken the battle system. The menus completely change. His level is maxed out, he now has powerful attacks for every craft type, none of which need any kind of cool-off. He refuses to pick up items because he just doesn't need them anymore. He can heal whenever he wants, and dying instantly brings him back to the very same spot. The game has built Siffrin's power up so much that the only logical progression is to just make him invincible. Thus, the journey up the house turns into a pointless, disorienting slog. Battles last only one turn, and Siffrin is so completely overpowered that nothing he does has any consequence. Any facade that Siffrin is at all subject to the rules of his reality is completely shattered. I think that this effective time travel proves a clear element of ESAT's self-commentary. Laying it out like this, the game's trick is pretty simple. It just kind of gives you an RPG that you are finished with by Act 2. It then makes you diegetically save scum to unlock additional content within scenes you've already played, and diegetically overlevel your main character. In doing this, Siffrin is now able to act as a very direct parallel for a player who's just kind of dicking around in a game he's already completed. He already knows how to defeat every obstacle and can do it easily, and he already knows how everything ends. He's stuck in Postgame forever. Channel regulars will know I myself haven't been an epic gamer for very long, but I do have a few UDTR lore videos under my belt, and the mid-act segments of ESAT really do, in my opinion, emulate the feeling of doing a canonical lore playthrough. Making Siffrin backtrack through every floor to find the 8 different required books feels like replaying the Undertale pacifist route to screenshot every time they mention Kara. Like, okay, me and my friend Eggwatch play Deltarune together, and the other day I watched her pop open Chapter 3 and casually beat the Roaring Knight for like the 80th time, just to make sure she didn't forget to screenshot any flavor text for her own theory. Like, do you remember that first day and a half where the Roaring Knight in Deltarune was unbeatable? Where the idea of being able to do it again in Wind was mind-blowing? Now it's routine. That's what the king fight is doing to you diegetically. A player who has completed the final obstacle of a game many times to the point of being able to do it with ease is going to find themselves with a secret second motive unaccounted for by the game, to complete it better or faster or to wring some more content out of it, see what happens if I do X, etc. However, that player must still obey the bounds of a world that is incapable of understanding that motivation. This disconnect, that of reaching the limit to which the mechanics of a game can account for your own knowledge, is what causes immersion to break. Siffrin has decided to inform no one he is looping, and therefore limit himself to this player state, forever running back and forth through a linear quest full of unchanging people. He and us are interacting with the world in inherently eldritch fashion, and this very disconnect is what fuels his slow descent into isolation, which turns into madness as he essentially loses immersion in his party members as people. So what's the point now? He's done everything, seen everything, gotten the strongest he possibly can. Why is he still playing? As you progress, the reason behind Siffrin's conspicuous lack of backstory is gradually revealed. His home country, known only as the island north of Vogard, has been erased from existence, rendering him unable to recall his childhood, understand his native language, or even speak the name of his home without the fabric of reality forcing it back down. He is able to uncover more and more information about his home as the loop continues, yet eventually he hits a wall, unable to say the name of his island without looping. There's a very deliberate subtext to the way Siffrin's loss is portrayed. His culture is something deeply embedded into his identity. It informs how he was raised, the random turns of phrase he uses, yet all completely subconsciously. No matter how hard he tries, Siffrin cannot consciously recall anything about his upbringing, and the world, influenced by his island to the point of finding its remnants everywhere, has forgotten it. I think this line of Isabeau's is quite illustrating, where he describes trying to remember the island as trying to remember your first steps. The memories are impossible to uncover yet foundational, something buried so deep in Siffrin that it's inaccessible to him. It's hard to tell exactly which real-world country this island is meant to emulate, and cultures in ESAT aren't one-to-one with the ones they're inspired by anyway. I think if the French truly did worship the concept of change, we would live in a very different society. But judging by Sif's island nation containing Malanga fritters, and most people having thick curly hair like Mirabelle's, paired with some handy word of God confirmation, Sif's birth family is probably fantasy Afro-Caribbean, most likely Cuban, thus revealing one of the true villains of ESAT, colonialism. Or one aspect of it anyway. ESAT narrows in on the specific topic of assimilation and loss of culture. Siffrin is fundamentally a foreigner to Vogard. He has no personal connection to or investment in its beliefs. No matter how they are pitched to him, he will never gain the same love for it that someone steeped in it since birth would have. It is not his. Yet his own language and holidays and religious beliefs have been forcibly ripped from him, and he has existed apart from them for so long that he no longer knows his exact place in them. A large part of his personal identity is now only negative space. In Stars and Time, I believe, is very unique in the way it frames these issues. There's plenty of media out there that explores the destruction of cultures so sadly common in all their bloody and expansive detail. Siffrin experiences this loss on an incredibly small and personal scale. He, like many people of many diasporas, has been taken away from his own culture, and has simply forgotten his own language, cultural customs, and religion, and that's something there's no real replacement for. And his island, like an ever-growing amount of indigenous and minority cultures, is shrinking from cultural memory to the point of the world painting over its existence. His complexes are additionally deepened by the amnesia he suffers as a result of his island's erasure. Sif constantly worries that his inability to remember his childhood is a result of some personal failing. He sees his physical struggle to remember things as him being stupid. He hides the extent of them to his party out of shame, and when possible, he plays it off as him simply not caring about things enough to remember them, something he is subconsciously terrified is the case. Siffrin treats his lack of depth perception caused by his loss of an eye in this same way. These are things he mercilessly beats himself up for being physically unable to overcome. If this somehow wasn't always obvious, it should be clear by now that Siffrin really hates himself. He is self-destructive to the point I've been neglecting to talk about it because it honestly seems like low-hanging fruit. This guy is far too okay with killing himself repeatedly and sacrificing his physical well-being near constantly for his friend's sake. There's a lot of great analysis out there about Sif as a representation of mental illness. I'd say it's one of the more talked-about aspects of the game. I've been neglecting it as it's not the focus of this specific video, and because, while I believe it is done quite well, it's one of the aspects of ESAT I personally have the most nuanced feelings about the execution of. All that being said, the visceral undercurrent of suicidality to Sif cannot be ignored. Siffrin is clearly a mentally ill character since before the time loop. These elements combined create the perfect storm for him. This belonging he's found with his party is terrifyingly fragile in his eyes. He cannot remember the last time he had a family, and he comes to learn that the one he had was stolen from his own memory. This is the first real experience of acceptance, and in his mind, it is constantly under the threat of his own amnesia creeping in on it to steal the experiences from him as they're happening. Siffrin simply has no faith that this good moment will not eventually be taken from him. Therefore, the only way to ensure he can never be left alone is to keep this moment exactly the same. Not only can his family not change, his specific dynamic with his family cannot change. He must keep himself as their mysterious ally who the group knows nothing about, whose inner turmoil is invisible to them, and to whom he has never been emotionally vulnerable. Since he is so closed off, him opening up to his teammates would, no matter how well they take it, fundamentally change his dynamic with them, and Siffrin can't risk any change at all. So he has to stay the funny jokes pun person. He has no past and an irrelevant future. He knows everything about his teammates who can know nothing about him in return. He's happy to run up and down the house to snoop through Mira's stuff to learn she's trying out dating, and then travel back in time to Dormont to help her through it, because Mira, in this moment, is the anxious, emotionally vulnerable one who needs the help of her teammates to not be constantly freaking out, and he is the cool, mysterious loner who just so happens to sometimes know the right thing to say. Never mind that this asymmetrical relationship is, rightfully so, a horrifying concept to Mirabelle, that her understandable anxieties around being Vogart's chosen hero and being rejected by the change belief are something she probably isn't a fan of being treated as a side quest for Siffrin to solve. Never mind that a relationship where one party is a complex three-dimensional human being and the other a blank vessel for experiencing the friendship is not sustainable. Never mind that his party doesn't want to be shoved into the former role. You can see on repeated friend quests that Siffrin straight up comes up with ways to improve these emotional talks with his friends that would make them feel even better. But he still doesn't change his own behavior, because it has stopped being about actually helping them. It is now simply about maximizing their established dynamic and forcing them to stay exactly the same. So he continues along this perfect moment in time, even as he exhausts every opportunity he'll let himself take. He turns himself into a silent protagonist and into the player of an endlessly looping game, continuing until he starts to see his own treasured allies as nothing more than actors on a stage. Eventually, they are no longer real people, only endlessly repeating lines of dialogue. Thus creates the catch-22 that defines Siffrin's torment, the reason he has gotten stuck in the first place, and the very thing keeping him from getting out, his inability to handle the slightest disturbance of his relationship with his party members, not just by being separated them, but by talking to them or admitting to them that there is anything wrong. That is the thing that will send him into complete loop-fueled madness. And that can be used to crack open the aspect of fantasy I believe ESAT is most trying to tackle, the inherent contradiction of re-entering a fantasy world after the immersion has worn off. Your suspension of disbelief in a game is very fragile and the content is finite. You can reach the limit of what you can interact with easily. Unfortunately, the very thing that drives one to reopen a game to the point of knowing it so well the illusion of interactivity has been broken is that initial sense of immersion. We love fictional characters because, to some level, they feel like living, breathing people. Sif loves his party so much that he is willing to re-experience their last day together over and over again, to maximize its perfection, to prevent it from changing in any way. He likes being the player. It's easy and nice to let the people around him be people without having to put any of himself out there in return. However, this is the very aspect that will cause his eventual descent. Siffrin perfectly illuminates a very specific aspect of immersion and fantasy that I rarely see explored: how easy it can be to ruin it for yourself. If I can get personal for a minute, one of the reasons I love this game is because I relate to this. I am an extremely obsessive person, as evidenced by my last hour and 15-minute long upload analyzing an Undertale character with under 5 minutes of screen time. And I too have a very, very hard letting go of the things I like. I have a hard time imprinting on new pieces of media, and as a result, I sometimes end up holding on to old interests long after I can feel I've exhausted them. It's a vicious cycle I'm sure many neurodivergent creative types can relate to. And while I personally absolutely believe my hyperfixations are a net positive for me, I appreciate works that understand that having one single story as the only thing you have going for you in your miserable life isn't always good for your enjoyment of that thing. It's a huge burden to place on it, and it turns what should be a safe, positive hobby into a bizarrely high-stakes experience. When you're really, really obsessed with something, to the point it consumes your entire life, when it's the thing that makes you happy, the idea of the passion fading, even a little, of having to let that thing go becomes unbearable. I mentioned at the beginning that In Stars and Time's meta-elements only work because the story itself, at a base level, is very good. I think the specific ways in which ESAT is unique only drive its point further. Many have pointed out that this game contains a lot of incredible representation. Pretty much every character is some confirmed flavor of LGBTQ. The game takes great pains to explore Mirabelle and Sifrin's aspectrum identity. Isabeau describes his gender transition. The character's non-romantic, semi-familial bond is elevated to something just as important as blood family or romance in a way that isn't common. In Stars and Time is a very specific game. It gets very granular and personal about a few select topics that its audience is likely to relate to, even down to the shameless, I don't know how to describe this other than fandominess of the game. Like, a major world-building element in this universe is a fucking Tumblr meme reference. It is lab-created to be relatable to its exact target audience of people who probably have dyed hair and pronouns and did theater in high school and read Homestuck. These things are rare. Most games do not have this kind of representation. Most people who relate to these elements are used to being the butt of the joke in even their favorite pieces of media. If you latch on to these elements, it can make you feel about these characters the same way Sifrin feels about his family, like you found a belonging that you have no logical grounds to believe might ever happen again, and therefore you need to hold on to this moment in time and milk it for all it's worth. You may have come to understand and expect that most pieces of art, most people, are not going to understand some core aspects of you. So when you do feel understood, that moment is so precious that you can get caught up in just wanting it to last as long as possible. Damn, this got really sappy. I probably sound like a broken record talking about these themes of the downsides of investment in fiction, given my Ralsei and to a lesser extent my Chris videos covered similar topics. I just find ESAT and UDTR's exploration of the often romanticized theme of artistic obsession to be both unique and fascinating. I know I feel a little silly being the kind of person who ruins media for myself by being too invested in it. Like, seriously, Rontu, are you really turning liking a game into something to be miserable about? But in this aspect, I deeply respect ESAT for acknowledging the desperation that comes with seeing the things you love as finite, and for telling the audience that it's okay to move on. Sifrin's pain at losing his home and fear of losing his friends is real, and it's not something he can solve by going deeper into unreality. Knowledge of his people lies outside of this tiny perfect moment. True belonging lies in the future, too. In Stars and Time shines in how it delivers on the meta-narrative fuckery with an empathetic conclusion. It understands why people lose themselves in fantasy, and it counters that purposefully. It isn't about not caring about fiction or about your friends, or even caring about them less. It's about trusting your care for them enough to allow them to grow and change alongside you. Thank you guys for sitting through this one. It really was daunting to stray from my UDTR niche to write it, but I guess I have to practice what I preach and enforce a Deltarune break upon myself. Again, I highly recommend, if you've somehow made it this far without doing so, that you play ESAT yourself. It is extremely worth it to even play Spoiled. It's been great to see it slowly gain more traction and popularity throughout the time I've been in the fandom, and also, holy shit guys, thanks for 10k. Don't you love all this change and progress? I sure hope nothing happens to